Hey everyone, tonight we're going to talk about the quietest kind of invasion. Imagine someone entering your life, not with a weapon, but with a warm bowl of soup, not with threats, but with an offer of help so constant, so insistent, that it slowly erases you from your own story. They don't break down your door. They just show up with a spare key you never gave them, until you can't remember if the house was ever truly yours to begin with. This is a story about the insidious nature of control disguised as care, a reminder that the deepest wounds aren't always inflicted by fists, but by soft, relentless hands that rearrange your world while you're sleeping. You might not survive this kind of silent siege with your mind intact, so before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In the comments, I'd love to see where you're all listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Leonie was not a woman who lost her footing easily. She was a planner, a list maker, the kind of person who assembled IKEA furniture just for fun, and actually had leftover parts that were supposed to be leftover. She had charted her life with a calm precision, and motherhood, she believed, would be no different. A challenge, yes. Demanding, certainly. But she hadn't anticipated the loneliness. She hadn't prepared for the profound, creeping doubt that began to cloud her days. A fog that had nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with the woman who was supposed to be helping her. What Leonie was experiencing wasn't just the overwhelming reality of being a new mother. It was a constant, low-grade battle against an invisible force. A weariness that didn't come from sleepless nights, but from the daily struggle to defend a territory that was, by all rights, her own. It was the feeling that someone else had quietly started pulling the strings of her life. Politely, with warm words, but without permission. Her mother-in-law, Elizabeth, had never been what you'd call warm, exactly. Present, yes, always present, but after the baby was born, her presence became a permanent fixture. Suddenly, she was in the apartment every single day. She'd arrive bearing soup, a peace offering that felt more like an admission ticket. She'd change the baby's clothes without asking, swapping the soft cotton onesie Leonie had picked out for a starchy, formal-looking outfit that seemed wildly impractical for a newborn. She'd rearrange the furniture, ever so slightly, muttering about better energy flow or something. It's a known fact that our brains are hardwired to notice minute changes in our environment as a survival instinct, a predator moving a single blade of grass. For Leonie, the predator smelled faintly of lavender and judgment. Elizabeth spoke in a voice that was soft and melodic, a voice that simply didn't register the word no. Everything was for the baby's sake, everything was framed as help, and everything was done with the unspoken assertion that she, Elizabeth, simply knew better. At first, it was just a background hum of discomfort for Leonie, but soon it became something more tangible, something she couldn't ignore. A strange, cloying scent on the pillowcase in the bassinet, a message from the pediatrician's office about a rescheduled appointment she never made, a baby who cried inconsolably at night for no discernible reason. And through it all, Leonie felt herself shrinking, a slow, painful erosion of self. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment her trust in her own mind began to crumble. Was it the time she found the baby wailing in his crib, even though she was certain she had just rocked him to sleep on her chest a few minutes prior? Or when the bottle of formula on the counter was suddenly half empty while any memory of having prepared it seemed to have been surgically removed from her brain? It was a classic case of what academics now call maternal gatekeeping. Only in reverse. The gate wasn't being kept. It was being dismantled from the outside, hinge by rusty hinge. Perhaps the real turning point was the moment her husband Mark looked at her with that gentle, pitying smile, the one that made her feel like a stray cat, and said, "Honey, you've been mixing up times a lot lately." It wasn't a sentence meant to comfort. It was a dismissal. It was a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of her exhaustion, a seed she would soon have to fight every single day. Mark had always lived in his mother's long shadow. A quiet nod from Elizabeth, a fleeting glance, and he would instantly alter his course. Leonie saw it clearly in the first few weeks. He'd be adjusting the baby's stroller, and one look from his mother would have him changing the angle of the sunshade as if obeying a silent, sacred command. An invisible hand was always there, steering him. He had never learned to say no to her. In his childhood, Elizabeth was the sole authority, a combination of safe harbor and strict law. She set the rules, and her word was final. For him, this rigid structure wasn't stifling. It was comforting, a foundation. The old wisdom says, the longest road out is the shortest road in. And for Mark, the road in always led back to his mother's approval. He just hadn't found the exit ramp yet. When Leonie tried to share her fears, her growing anxieties about his mother's constant presence, she was met not with understanding, but with a weary bewilderment. Her concerns sounded to him like an overreaction, an affront to a woman who was only trying to help. To him, Leonie's doubts weren't a warning sign. They were a sign of ingratitude. He'd retreat, shutting down any conversation that veered into uncomfortable territory, leaving her to face Elizabeth alone. The more she pleaded with him to take a stand, the deeper he burrowed into the familiar role of the devoted son, convinced that his mother could do no wrong. It wasn't malice on his part. It was a profound, lifelong conditioning. Admitting Elizabeth might be acting out of a need for control, not love, would mean questioning his entire foundation, and he wasn't ready for that kind of earthquake. Not yet. Leonie was fighting a war on two invisible fronts, one against a mother-in-law who didn't recognize boundaries, and the other against a husband who refused to see them. And as the days bled into weeks, the fine cracks in her reality began to widen into chasms. The world she had so carefully built for her child was being subtly, insidiously rearranged, with every misplaced object, every forgotten date. Her own confidence eroded. The small things were the worst. A glass moved to a different shelf was one thing, but then it was the special hypoallergenic diaper cream, the one that finally stopped the baby's rash, suddenly vanishing from the changing table only to reappear a day later in the back of the linen closet. "You're just so tired, sweetie," Mark would say, his voice dripping with a sympathy that felt like condescension. The arts termin, the doctor's appointment. That was a big one. She had it written down, triple-checked, a crucial 2-month checkup. She'd planned her entire day around it, but when she arrived, the receptionist looked at her with polite confusion. "Oh, that was rescheduled for next Tuesday," she said. "We got a call this morning." Leonie stood there, baby in her arms, feeling the hot flush of humiliation. She hadn't made that call. Back home, Mark's face was a mask of patient concern. "Are you sure you didn't call and forget? You've had a lot on your mind." He was operating on a level of confirmation bias so profound it could have been studied by science. Any evidence that didn't fit his narrative of a perfect mother and a stressed-out wife was simply discarded. Leonie was caught in a trap. To argue felt hysterical. To stay silent felt like a surrender. She felt like she was losing her mind, and the scariest part was that the person who was supposed to be her anchor was the one gently pushing her adrift. She fought against it, this feeling of being manipulated, but it was like trying to punch smoke. How do you prove that the gentle squeeze of a hand is actually a grip of steel? How do you explain that a loving smile feels like a threat then, late one night, while endlessly scrolling on her phone, the new parent's only true companion besides caffeine, she stumbled across a sentence on some random forum. It wasn't profound or poetic, it was simple, direct, and it hit her with the force of a physical blow. The sentence read, "If you feel like you are being manipulated, you probably are." It wasn't new information. It was a name for the beast she'd been fighting in the dark. It was permission to trust the one person she'd been forced to doubt. Herself. The feeling was no longer a phantom. It had a name. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived like clockwork, carrying a casserole that smelled suspiciously of victory. She hung her coat on the hook by the door and immediately swept into the living room to coo at the baby. Leonie's heart hammered against her ribs. An ancient proverb says, "The faintest ink is more powerful than the strongest memory." And she suddenly knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she needed to find the ink. She needed proof. Her hands trembled as she walked to the coat. The act itself felt like a profound betrayal of her own dignity. She was a guest in her own home, rifling through pockets like a common thief. She just wanted to be wrong. She prayed she would find nothing but a crumpled tissue and a tube of lipstick. But her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular tucked into an inner pocket. It was a small, worn notebook, its corners soft and frayed from use. Unassuming, ordinary. She flipped it open. The pages were filled with a tight, meticulously neat script. This wasn't a shopping list. It wasn't a diary. It was something else. It was a logbook, a collection of protocols. On one page, a stark entry, 3 a.m., feeding bottle. Child overstimulated. Mother is unstable. A few pages later, spoke today about wanting to see her old friend from Portland. Why doesn't she realize it's not possible? Leonie's breath hitched. Portland was a pipe dream, a half-joked about idea of escape she'd mentioned to Mark in passing. How did Elizabeth even know about that? It was a throwaway comment, but here it was, recorded as evidence of her flightiness. It's funny, the things people choose to write down. The famous diarist Samuel Pepys wrote about the Great Fire of London. Sure, but he also wrote about his new watch and his terrible constipation. Elizabeth's diary, however, had a singular, chilling focus. The entries were short, cool sentences that raised more questions than they answered, meticulous observations, clinically recorded, assessed, dissected. This wasn't the journal of a helpful grandmother. This was the ledger of a saboteur. It was a clear, calculated plan, and in this plan, Leonie was being systematically demoted from the protagonist to a problematic side character in her own life. She snapped the book shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. Her knees went weak, and she grabbed the edge of a console table to keep from falling. She could hear her own blood pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, terrifying silence of understanding. In that single, awful moment, she knew. She wasn't going crazy. She wasn't paranoid. She wasn't just tired. She was a subject in an experiment she hadn't consented to. Part of a scenario someone else had written for her, adding another line, another damning observation with each passing day. She thought finding the notebook was the worst of it. She thought now she could act, protect herself. But what she held in her hand was only the first crack in a wall, and she had no idea that behind it lay a whole hidden architecture of lies, manipulation, and psychological warfare that was far more extensive than she could ever imagine. And it was a structure that held her husband just as captive as her, even if he didn't know it yet. After Leonie slid the little notebook back into the coat pocket, a strange and terrible calm settled over her. The world hadn't changed, but her perception of it had been irrevocably altered. It was like seeing in color for the first time. Only all the colors were shades of dread. That evening, as she locked the front door, she checked the deadbolt twice. It wasn't about small boundary crossings anymore. It was about something else, something that moved silently and invisibly. With the goal of swallowing her world whole, what she didn't know was that the invisible was about to become terrifyingly visible. The night that followed was still and heavy. Mark was out late, a rare team-building dinner with colleagues that usually just involved complaining about work over overpriced beer. The baby was asleep in the nursery, and Leonie had drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep when a sound pulled her out of it. It was a tiny, barely audible creak from somewhere in the hall. In the daylight, she would have dismissed it as the house settling, but in the thick darkness of 2 a.m., the sound had weight. It had intention. She listened, straining her ears against the silence. Nothing, but something inside her, a primal alarm that had been ringing quietly for weeks, was now screaming. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold wood of the floor. She moved with a caution that felt foreign in her own home. Each step a carefully measured placement to keep the old floorboards from groaning. And then she smelled it. That heavy, sweet, and cloying perfume, a floral scent that always seemed to announce Elizabeth's presence before she even entered a room. It was a perfume that probably had a lovely French name, but to Leonie it smelled only of intrusion. It had no business being in her house at this hour, unannounced. She was not alone. As she reached the nursery door, she pressed the handle down with infinite slowness. In the sliver of pale light filtering in from a street lamp, she saw the scene. A stooped figure, a silhouette hunched over the baby's crib. Elizabeth, her back was to the door. As Leonie pushed the door open, Elizabeth startled, and with a swift, furtive movement, she placed a small bottle on the changing table behind her. The baby whimpered softly in his sleep. Elizabeth straightened up and turned, her face a placid mask in the dim light. She looked at Leonie with an expression of almost sorrowful concern. Her voice, when she spoke, was a quiet, gentle murmur. "I just wanted to soothe him," she said. He was fussing. But Leonie's gaze was fixed on the small dark bottle on the commode. It was a chilling echo of a dark past. In the 19th century, mothers and nurses commonly used laudanum-laced infant quietners to manage fussy babies. Elizabeth was just continuing a long, terrible tradition. Without a word, Leonie walked past her mother-in-law. She reached into the crib, lifted her son, and held him tight against her chest. His small body felt so warm and fragile. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was steady and cold as stone. "Kyo," she said, just the one word. For a moment Elizabeth didn't move, her face unreadable. Then a faint sad smile touched her lips. "You're overreacting again, dear," she murmured, before turning and walking silently out of the room. A few moments later, Leonie heard the soft click of the front door closing. The next morning, before the city had fully woken up, Leonie was at the police station, the small bottle tucked safely in her purse. She didn't file a report. She didn't make a scene. She simply asked if they could test the contents. She needed clarity. She needed science to fight the ghosts of gaslighting. The 3 days that followed were a special kind of hell. Then the call came. The lab tests had found traces of a benzodiazepine, a sedative, not a fatal dose, not an acute poison, but a substance that had absolutely no place in a baby's system. That evening, when she told Mark, she didn't get the reaction she'd hoped for. There was no outrage, no sudden clarity. Instead, she witnessed a profound, almost desperate rejection of reality. "It has to be a mistake," he kept saying, pacing the living room. "The lab made a mistake. Mom would never She just wanted to help." He was a textbook case of cognitive dissonance and his mind physically unable to hold two opposing ideas at once. The loving mother he knew, and the woman who would drug his child, as Benjamin Franklin once wrote, 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. The secret was out now, and Mark was trying desperately to kill it. Leonie didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked to her dresser, took out the small worn notebook, and handed it to him. He took it, confused. As he began to read, his pacing stopped. His face, once twisted with denial, went slack. It wasn't a sudden breakdown. It wasn't a moment of dramatic realization. It was the slow, painful sight of a man's entire world cracking down the middle. The cool, detached observations, the clinical judgment. Mother is unstable. He read the lines, and the foundation of his life began to turn to dust. Leonie knew this wasn't the end. His seeing the truth wasn't the same as him being ready to act on it. That night, her point was proven. As she was getting ready for bed, she found a piece of paper slipped under her apartment door. On it, a single sentence in that same neat, familiar handwriting. "You don't know what you are doing to him." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an apology. It was the calm, unshakable testament of a woman who believed with every fiber of her being that Leonie was the real danger. And in that moment, Leonie knew she had to protect her child not just from Elizabeth, but from an entire system of belief that saw a monster and called it love. The note under the door was the last drop of poison in a cup that was already overflowing. Elizabeth hadn't just crossed a line. She operated as if lines were a petty inconvenience for other people. That same day, Leonie applied for a temporary restraining order. It wasn't a decision made in the heat of passion, but with the cold, clear resolve of a survivor. The process itself was a slog through a swamp of paperwork and quiet, sterile rooms, a reminder that the law is, as the old actor Charles Macklin once said, a sort of hocus-pocus science to those on the outside. But Leonie didn't care. She was done being polite. She was done doubting herself. A day later, the police went to Elizabeth's house. It was late afternoon. They found her not in a state of panic, but in the middle of her weekly baking ritual. An apple cake, just like every Wednesday. She showed no surprise, no resistance. When the officers entered, she calmly set the half-finished cake aside, dusted the flour from her hands, and asked if she could fetch her jacket, her voice exuding the calm of a woman who has always believed herself to be in the right. She let them lead her away as if she were heading to a long, scheduled appointment, not a holding cell. The weeks leading up to the trial passed in a strange haze of relief and a deep, gut-clenching anxiety. Relief that the immediate threat was gone, that she could breathe in her own home without smelling that perfume. But anxiety for what was to come. Leonie knew that courtrooms were poor theaters for the whole truth, They dealt in facts and evidence, not in the slow, creeping terror of psychological warfare. 4 months after the arrest, the trial began. Elizabeth appeared in a crisp blouse and pearl earrings, her posture upright and impeccable. She looked less like a defendant and more like she was about to preside over a meeting of the local historical society. Her gaze swept past Leonie and her own son without a flicker of recognition, barely even grazing the judge. The entire proceeding seemed to be beneath her dignity. The charges were laid out, clear and cold: felony assault, endangerment of a child, psychological abuse, trespassing, and possession of controlled substances with malicious intent, a laundry list of crimes that individually might have been argued away, but woven together they told a story that could no longer be ignored. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with tired eyes, called it a system of familial subversion. She spoke of a quiet, insidious replacement of the mother by a person who was never asked. The most damning testimony came from a court-appointed psychological evaluator. He described Elizabeth as a personality with a potent cocktail of narcissistic structure and a profound, deep-seated compulsion for control. This wasn't just a quirky, overbearing grandmother. This was, in his words, a manifestation of pathological altruism, where the act of helping becomes a vehicle for control and causes legitimate harm. He explained that her own unaddressed traumas had metastasized into a need to manage everyone else's life because she had so thoroughly failed to manage her own. It's a funny thing about the legal system's relationship with psychology. The attempt to explain a motive can sometimes sound like an excuse. The legal concept of guilty but mentally ill is a tightrope walk over a canyon of nuance, and Elizabeth was walking it with unnerving poise. For the first 2 days, Elizabeth herself sat motionless, as if watching a dull play for which she had been given a complimentary ticket. But on the 3rd day, in the middle of the prosecutor's questioning, she suddenly stood. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, carrying across the silent courtroom. "I have harmed no one," she stated, "not as a plea, but as a fact. I only helped. I only wanted to prevent a child from falling into the hands of a mother who cannot feel what her own child needs. I replaced," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "what was missing." Then she paused and her eyes scanned the room. She posed a question, not to the judge or the prosecutor, but to the air itself. "If that was so wrong," she asked, "then why was I needed?" The courtroom was silent for a beat. The judge, an older woman with a face that had seen everything, leaned forward slightly. Her reply was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a razor. "Because, madam," she said, her voice devoid of pity, "you gave yourself that role." The verdict was guilty. The sentence wasn't prison, not in the traditional sense. It was an order for indefinite commitment to a secure psychiatric facility. It wasn't about retribution, and it certainly didn't feel like a victory that could heal anything. But it was a boundary, a line, finally drawn in concrete and steel. As Leonie left the courthouse, she passed Mark in the hallway. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw no defiance, no defense, just a hollowed-out emptiness, a void. Maybe, she thought, he was finally beginning to understand the depth of the abyss they had been living in. What she couldn't know at that moment was that in Elizabeth's room at the facility, staff would later find a second small, worn notebook, just like the first, and on one of the last pages in that same meticulous, steady hand was a single, chilling sentence. "I was never alone." 4 years had passed since Elizabeth was committed. 4 years in which Leonie learned to breathe again, to build a new life, not on the ashes of the old one, but on new, solid ground. She laid herself. She and her son had moved to a smaller city, into a bright apartment with a crooked balcony and a shared garden that smelled of damp earth and possibility. It was not a fairy tale ending. The past wasn't a forgotten country. It was a scar she carried, but a scar that no longer ached with every step. It was simply a part of her. Her husband, Mark, had stayed. Physically at least, but the cord that connected them, already frayed from years of his silence and willful blindness, had snapped during the trial. Their marriage didn't end with a bang. It disintegrated quietly, like old fabric turning to dust. He was a ghost in their new life, and eventually ghosts have to move on. Leonie had learned to trust herself again, a slow and painstaking process. She no longer looked for validation from those who were supposed to be her family. Then came the official letter, The dry, bureaucratic language informed her that Elizabeth had been a model patient in the facility. They used words like cooperative and stabilized. They spoke of geriatric mitigation, a fancy term for her getting older and seeming calmer. The professional consensus was that she no longer presented an acute danger and was ready to be reintegrated into society. It was meant to be informational. For Leonie, it felt like a storm warning. She tried to put it out of her mind. She had a new life. Her son was a happy, loud, vibrant boy who loved dinosaurs and despised broccoli. Her life was calm until a Tuesday afternoon when she found an envelope in her mailbox. No return address, no stamp, just her first name, written in that elegant, precise, instantly recognizable script. Her hands didn't even tremble as she opened it. The panic was gone, replaced by a quiet, resigned vigilance. As the old saying goes, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Leonie was learning that in her very bones. Inside wasn't a letter, it was a single photograph, a picture of her son taken from a distance on the playground of his kindergarten. He was wearing the little blue jacket she had helped him put on that very morning. In the background, artfully blurred but there, unmistakable, was a sliver of a familiar coat, a wisp of silver hair, and the faint curve of a smile. Leonie didn't have to look twice to know who it was. On the back of the photo, one sentence, written in that same steady hand, "You know where I belong." The message was clear. Elizabeth didn't belong in an institution or in a halfway house. She believed she belonged right there, in the background of her grandson's life, a silent, watchful guardian. This time, Leonie didn't react with fear, but with consequence. She calmly placed the photograph in a drawer, locked it, and called her lawyer. She obtained a permanent no-contact order. No visits, no letters, no approaching the kindergarten, no accidental encounters at the grocery store. This time, Leonie didn't listen to any voices, internal or external, that might suggest she was overreacting. Years passed, her son grew older, the traces of those first nightmarish years faded, but they never vanished completely. A part of Leonie remained on high alert, an internal alarm system that would never fully go to sleep. It was much later that her instincts were proven tragically correct. News surfaced from another town. A young mother had gone to the police talking about her baby's sudden, severe sleep disturbances, about toys appearing in strange places, about bottles of milk that seemed to be tampered with. The pattern was chillingly familiar. This time, the suspicion was immediate and concrete. The clues led back to Elizabeth. She was arrested again, but this time the search of her apartment revealed something new. It wasn't just her own notebooks. It was a stack of handwritten letters, a correspondence. In them, she spoke not of I, but of we, of a shared mission to rescue children from unfit parents. This was a true clinical case of folie à deux, a madness of two. Her partner, the we in her letters, was an elderly man from a neighboring town who had been volunteering as a grandpa for hire at community centers. He had methodically gained the trust of that young family, an insidious presence that mirrored Elizabeth's own tactics. This case wasn't quite Munchausen by proxy, where a caregiver fakes illness for attention. This was something else, a kind of psychological kidnapping for the sake of control. Today, both Elizabeth and her accomplice are in separate, secure facilities, under constant supervision. No therapy has ever led to a genuine admission of guilt. Leonie never celebrated this outcome. There was no sense of triumph, no late-game justice. What she has, what she fought for and almost lost, is something quieter and more profound. Her voice, her child, and her own precious, hard-won life. And so, we leave Leonie's story here, in the quiet aftermath of a storm that raged for years within the supposedly safe walls of her own home. The sharp edges of the narrative begin to soften now, the chilling images of the courtroom and the little notebook fading into the gentle background hum we started with tonight. What remains is not the specter of Elizabeth's relentless obsession, but the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who was pushed to the very brink of her own sanity and found her way back, not by fighting fire with fire, but by finding the profound power in a single steady voice that refused to be silenced. Her story serves as a somber testament not to the insidious darkness that can hide behind a loving smile, but to the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the enduring light of a person's will to protect what is theirs. It's a quiet reminder that true safety is not a place, but a feeling that we build within ourselves, brick by brick, through trust and courage. May the silence that surrounds you now feel peaceful, a soft blanket rather than a heavy, watchful presence. May you find comfort in the simple knowledge that you are the sole author of your own story, the keeper of your own truth. And may you always, always trust the quiet instinct that whispers to you in the dark, for it is the purest and most honest voice you will ever know. Sleep well,